Hi, I'm Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Where in the world is Tim Mak? Well, this week he's in Taipei. Tim, welcome back. You're in Taipei. What have you been looking at this week?
We've been looking at a couple things, one of which is Taiwanese defense technology and what they're learning from the war in Ukraine, but also Taiwan's vulnerability to China in terms of what they've called here red beaches. That's the places where Taiwan believes is most likely for China to land their amphibious assault craft if they ever do engage in an invasion of Taiwan.
What measures, without divulging any secrets, of course, are the Taipei military and government doing to prevent an amphibious landing?
Things like hedgehogs on the beaches to prevent vehicles from moving up the beaches, fast mine laying naval vessels, which will leave mines along the coast. The Taiwanese military's perspective is to try to create as many costs as possible for the Chinese, not necessarily understanding that the Chinese military has a much greater capacity than the Taiwanese military. What they're interested in is asymmetric warfare. So things that will slow down the Chinese military, make them think maybe the costs of trying to do this is just too much. The Taiwanese are engaged in what they've told me this week is called the not today strategy. That is, every single day they want to convince planners in Beijing, we shouldn't do it today, not today, maybe tomorrow, and then tomorrow to make that same decision or convince them to make the same decision. What they're learning from with regards to Ukraine is they're learning ways in which they don't necessarily need to have a uh, population advantage, ways in which they can use technology to impose costs while reducing the risk to their own soldiers.
Have the Trump moves in Ukraine and vis-a-vis Russia, which we'll talk about in a moment, unsettled the folks in Taipei? Are they more concerned that perhaps
Yeah,
we wouldn't stand up to the Chinese if they made a military move?
there's a real kind of conventional wisdom that's developing here in Taipei about how after Ukraine, Taiwan's next. That there's this kind of theory that in general Trump wants to make grand bargains with the authoritarians of the world, and in so doing, will sell out Taiwan. You see this in some of the language he's used about Taiwan most recently, accusing them falsely and without evidence of stealing the semiconductor industry from the United States. Um, this is a deep, deep concern, and of course, China is watching too. China is watching to see what kind of backbone does the United States have right now? Are they going to stand up for their traditional allies? And the answer has been over and over again, no. In fact, traditional allies have been considered, these friendships have been considered currency, which Trump can now exploit. That's been the way that Trump has looked at friendships and bonds of affection that have been created through decades and decades of partnership and mutual benefit, and in many cases, bloodshed with one another as they fought for genuine uh, national security concerns from all sorts of alliances around the world.
Let's move to Ukraine because there were obviously some events of note this week. There was a so-called deal on mineral rights, and there may be less there than meets the eye. Tell us what that deal is really about and why each side made it.
A draft of the deal has been published by Ukrainian reporters, and the deal is really a deal to have future conversations about potential future deals. It is not a deal that um, that requires Ukraine to do anything in particular. It is a deal in which, inside the provisions, it says TBD, essentially. We'll decide exactly how this works, how much, how much how much American investment there will be in this deal. And this really only applies to future Ukrainian government exploration of oil, gas, and minerals. And so it doesn't apply to commercial exploration of those things. What it really does indicate in a broader sense is Donald Trump's willingness to sign any deal just to say he got a deal, and then to be able to repeat over and over again that it was such a great deal. And it should be no surprise to you, Jen, that that is exactly what's going to happen over the next few days. They're going to sign a deal of very little substance, where many of the details are left for future conversations or may never occur. But Donald Trump is going to feel like he got something out of it. He's going to talk about what a great deal it was. That said, it's a real dangerous precedent to set in terms of his style as to what may occur with the Ukraine-Russia peace talks, if you can even call it peace talks. It's very obvious that Donald Trump wants something symbolic and not something sustainable or just. And that's probably what we'll get. We'll probably get something that appeases him in some very superficial way. But the war will go on and the conflict will go on, and the situation will remain unresolved.
I think the defenders of Ukraine here in the United States had hoped that this mineral deal would do exactly what you said, that they would give him something and that would satisfy him. But at the same time, he is making these statements about Ukrainian aggression, which are abjectly false. He is saying things like the Russian behavior has been very good. And there is this palpable fear that if not to make a deal, and it's unclear what a deal would look like, but that he would substantially reduce or eliminate US support. How real is that threat? And what's the capacity? Here's, I think, where you have some particular expertise for the Europeans to backfill and for countries that have developed defense industries to fill the gap.
Trump puts himself out into the world as some master negotiator, but he is already kind of cut off or threatened to cut off flow of American aid to Ukraine. So what leverage does he have exactly? The Ukrainians are operating under the assumption that they may not get US aid already. So why should they change their behavior? With regards to European assistance, Europe in many ways has the will, but it doesn't have the capacity. It doesn't have to. It has really lived large off this peace dividend in the post-Cold War period, and has not considered war as a serious option until the last few years. A defense industry is not something that you can create overnight. And while there are some standouts in Europe, companies like Rheinmetall and Quantum Systems and Helsing, they don't have the same kind of defense manufacturing capabilities to step up and create the nuts and bolts of what you need to conduct a war in the near term. And it's going to take some years to do that. So while Europe has the will and the kind of symbolic support, that's what is fundamentally limited to in a way. It does not have the defense industry to be able to step up and say, we will backfill and take over the American contribution, make sure that Ukraine has everything that it needs. It's just not in a place to do so. Just to think about what the legislative process takes in the United States. No different in other legislatures around the world. It takes time. It takes deliberation. There are amendments. There are committee hearings. There are conversations. There are disagreements. And then after all of that, there needs to be reconciliation of all the problems that existed in that process. So you can, in democracies, you cannot just snap your finger and say, okay, well, we suddenly have enormous amounts of funds to go and purchase American weaponry for Ukraine. One way in which this could all occur is a way in which the EU becomes much more empowered to act as a kind of joint entity for all the constituent states in Europe. The EU, for example, borrowed vast amounts of monies as a sort of European Union entity to deal with the COVID pandemic. And that was the first time in which they did this sort of mass borrowing on that level. The EU could step up and do that. And that's been proposed as one of the ways in which they could raise money quickly and send it to Ukraine. Another option is that there's $300 billion in and frozen Russian assets that have been collected by Europe and other democratic states. And they could tap into that a little bit more than they currently have in order to provide that weaponry, or to provide access to those funds to purchase weaponry for Ukraine. But there's been a lot of resistance in Europe for that as well. All in all, it does not look good.
We did have elections in Germany last Sunday, and despite the intervention of the Vice President of the United States and the Secretary of State, the AfD did not gain enough seats to be part of the governing coalition. The German chancellor then turned around and made some very strong public statements about US interference. What has been the impact of those elections and of the German chancellor's, or soon to be German chancellor's, statements in terms of rallying the Europeans to kind of stand up to Trump, and to provide a unified front vis-a-vis Ukraine or other security issues?
What we've seen is everywhere around the world where the Trump administration has tried to assert itself, it has alienated its closest friends. We see this in Germany with the AfD, the far right party, which JD Vance encouraged Germans to be more supportive of or inclusive of, performing less well than they polled before JD Vance did that. We're seeing this in Canada, where the opposition Conservatives were considered a shoo-in if elections were to be held later this year. But all these threats about making Canada the 51st state and these threats on tariffs have rejuvenated the governing Liberals and made them super competitive in a country that has been suffering from high inflation and all sorts of economic problems, and it really is ripe for a change in party and governing party. But Trump has a certain way about him, which is to rally domestic opinion for whoever it is that he attacks. We saw that with Zelensky when Donald Trump called him a dictator. Zelensky's approval rating has been falling over the last few years, as you can imagine, but falling from 90+% to the mid 60s. I haven't seen any polls recently, but I would pretty much bet that he got a 20-point boost when Donald Trump called him a dictator and said that that he was illegitimate. Here's the thing. I mean, fundamentally, Europe is in a state of shock about what's happening with the United States. They had relied on America for so long as a partner. And these changes that need to be made for European sovereignty, for Europeans' defense, this is a process that's going to take years. And these are years in which authoritarians might take advantage. And that's the real danger about the situation that we're seeing.
We so appreciate your on the ground, in the moment reporting and analysis. We thank you. And wherever you may be in the world, we'll see you again soon. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jen.